So yesterday I read this article, Harry and Meghan confirm Netflix deal to be producers, something like that. And I've thought about it for a day, and now I want to make a recording about it. Um, this recording is going to touch on so many different issues, and I'm going to have to create sort of asides and tangents and sort of side arguments and points of general political or cultural expose to kind of get my thesis across. But yeah, obviously, I'm upset that Harry and Meghan become producers. Why? I mean, these people have no intrinsic merit to warrant the influence and access to people's minds and hearts and considerations and ethical framing. Uh, these are people who are effectively famous for being famous, who use their networking and connections as members of the royal family to segue themselves into uh, a position which remains unwarranted. I mean, I'm going to have okay, let me take a break and just say that I don't know all the facts of all the issues. I certainly am not um, an avid scourer and uh, uh, obsessed tracker of the life of the royals and the life and trials of Harry and Meghan. Um, I mean, I will give my reading of the situation, which I will warrant is probably roughly true. Uh, but as far as I can see, Meghan was probably not treated in any exceptional way to any other member of the immediate family of the royal household. Um, she was treated like any other would be royal. And in some sense, uh, if there was any difference in the kind of journalistic coverage that she was receiving, um, it was because her character was being probed, was being tested, in some sense, in the interests of the public, as the institution of the royal family has come to manifest itself in the life of uh, the British nation. And perhaps Meghan was slightly wanting on the issue of character, and she was overly reliant on this very convenient ideology of what I would regard as self-victimization, and playing into that and leaning into that escalated a kind of uh, a weird kind of self-denigrating, self-undermining uh, character doom spiral, which played itself out in the media in a bit of an ugly way, and essentially the I mean, I'm not going to say that royal coverage and journalism in England or Britain or whatever is is what I would regard as humane um, or generally justified in any way, shape, or form, and that it couldn't be managed in a more respectful and responsible manner. But um, there is, let's say, there is a price to being a royal, and it does require a certain strength of character. It is somewhat sort of a requisite for the role. And perhaps it's not an unfair uh, sequence of events that left. That's the wrong word. Perhaps what transpired in terms of Harry and Meghan's exit is not um, a completely fair evaluation on their character, but they fell short of the character required uh, to fulfill those roles and those titles, and the character was somewhat wanting. But perhaps, that's a human failing. Perhaps uh, the standard is quite high, and the character, I believe, was effectively, functionally being tested by the media. And so, in terms of what transpired, one can imagine that this is perhaps not an I don't know how to say this diplomatically. This is not an untoward consequence that they have exited those roles. Perhaps they were unfit for them, essentially. Not as in they're unfit people, but they were unfit to reach that high standard, or to meet that high standard, rather. And I do think that it must be regarded that Meghan was not treated exceptionally, and in some sense, part of her reaction or overreaction, and I understand that it's a stressful, hard situation, was perhaps because of the expectation of this weird hypothetical demand of expecting to be treated differently because of some kind of identity, sort of consideration, where identity has now become a major cultural token in this disgusting advent of, where which to me is quite weird, because then we have the situation where, let's say, high class people can actually consider themselves victims. And now they're going to produce our media. People are going to consume the products of their ethical framework, which in itself, I can't. Maybe Harry and Meghan are spectacular producers. I wouldn't know. Uh, but generally, one would hope that within our culture, that one would have a certain characteristic that would warrant that kind of social, cultural power and role. That that we could live in the semblance of somewhat of a meritocracy, in some sense. That in some sense, you are either putting your money behind something, or you have some kind of credential, in terms of the function that you are delivering. Let me see if I've covered everything that I've wanted to cover. I was thinking that I might have to sort of create an ad hoc uh, sort of rough thesis as to the merits of the royal family. I think I kind of got through that topic without needing to go there. well, I didn't sort of address it. I mean, I guess you could say that perhaps Harry and Meghan were, let's say, in their political consciousness, opposed to the institution of the royal family, perhaps. Um, this is a tangent, but I mean, I guess let me just weave together a rough outline of an argument for the British royal family. And again, I speak as somewhat of an insider, and I believe that my general knowledge on this subject is pretty good, but I might not be fully informed on all the facets. And there might also be things that I don't know which are likely to radically alter the trajectory of my framing, but I don't believe that that is the case. Um, the trajectory of the conclusion that precipitates from my framing is that the British royal family has really managed to conserve all the functioning elements of the virtue in a sovereign, in terms of the de facto devolution of political power that was constitutionally set up, I believe, by King Charles. And so, as the function of the British royal family then is essentially to create a stable metaphor, a kind of anthropomorphic, natural representation for the cohesive political body of the state, the cohesion of the political body that is the state. It's somewhat difficult in concept to owe allegiance to a democracy which essentially might change the character of its visage with each new vote. It's very easy to get cynical in such a constitutional arrangement. That kind of psychological difficulty is overcome by the British monarchy. So they essentially embody similar cultural elements to the original incarnation of sovereignty, and in some sense preserve and keep all the best, and in the British arrangement manage to obfuscate all the unsightly diminution of the citizenry. So it's somehow able, within its narrative, within its setup, capable of orchestrating essentially the best of both worlds, and it does actually achieve that, and it must be granted and granted praise for its accomplishment of that. Obviously, there's a human price to be paid for this public good, which is provided by the institution of royalty. and essentially that cost is borne by the royal family themselves, uh, who manage and play their role in this de facto devolution that also preserves the structure um, of the arrangement. It is a living arrangement, as it were. Um, and in some sense, the cohesion is only maintained because there is true loyalty to the sovereign. There is true devotion, and but that devotion and loyalty does not compromise um, the individual, and therefore it still creates what originally was, let's say, conceptually available in the original the original moral justification and moral structure of nobility. People forget the original function of nobility because it was generally only properly administered by the Russian Empire, uh, which was the major source of romantic philosophical um, and cultural and political sentiments and developments, um, which did not fare that well in Western Europe, um, and the engine of which was uh, destroyed in the Russian Revolution. But the function of nobility was the hope of anyone to work intergenerationally, perhaps even, toward doing some great and noble work and being entitled by the sovereign, being knighted, being um, brought up into peerage, and the the growth of the nobility was, in some sense, the byproduct of the conceptual manifestation of divine majesty. It was the project of the enrichment of the population via this incredibly um, what's the word, elaborate procedure of I mean, incredibly slow social mobility and upliftment that could not essentially be counted on, but which could be dreamt of. It was in the social imagination, at least. It lived in the concept and the metaphor. Um, that function is still maintained in the British royal arrangement, um, to a large degree. Although it's been somewhat, it's also been diluted. Perhaps, perhaps this is that dilution is a necessary reframing of the same kind of metaphorical, in some sense, that dilution is required in order to create the cultural space of the liberal paradigm, as it were, of the individual British liberal political consciousness, that one is not bestowed nobility only by an external authority, but one cultivates it oneself in terms of one's own sensibility and notion of self-sovereignty, which is metaphorically depicted by the external sovereign as a calling card, as an archetype, um, and which becomes a cultural metaphor, which is important for which is an important ingredient to a healthy, self-reflective, um, contemplative, considered life, in which institution, an institution like the royal family, is a public good, um, is a deeply ingrained metaphor, and those who fulfill its function are also capable of exemplifying to us authentic nobility and leading moral virtue, leading the way in terms of moral virtue. So, um, so perhaps it is right that when also people join that um, institution, or are grafted into it, that their characters are tested. I mean, again, I will say that I can't. I mean, it is certainly. I don't wish to be undignified. I don't wish to be overly denigrating on this point, but one must understand that the extreme uniqueness of the members of the royal household, in terms of the function, the social function, or in terms of the position and role in society. And I don't mean this in a denigrating way, but that kind of, in the same way that the celebrities of America are fulfill a role which makes them de facto social misfitted. I mean, it's not as if they cannot lead healthy social lives, but they have to do so in an augmented way. Um, they have to facilitate uh, their interactions via um, special channels, perhaps, and but and they also perhaps have some perhaps rightfully earned uh, uh, powers and compensatory privileges which allow them to facilitate that. Um, those special limitations. Now, obviously, those limitations are freakish. They are they force one into a rather insulated uh, way of relating, which I must say as well is very much akin to the identity politics way of relating to the world, in which one is leveraging sort of introjective objects to idealistically or abstractly represent every element of reality in order to be able to craft authoritative narratives which can even be constructed post hoc to reframe reality and to insulate a self-regarded, self-involved mentality. Okay, well, anyway, I say that because that is specifically what I perhaps see in the ideology that has been uh, almost by osmosis in terms of this uh, decadent generation that has indulged in a kind of a debauched ethical um, program of so-called anti-racism, which is so racially obsessed and hate-filled that it is on the lookout to create and hunt down convenient ideological scapegoats, um, which further entrench a insulated self-regard. Anyway, you know, the extent to which, I mean, this is a depravity which is open to to everyone and anyone, of course, but obviously a life which is marked by conditions which are peculiar and unique, perhaps especially promote the development of this kind of self uh, if I had a better vocabulary, I could perhaps generate some better descriptions. But a at least a self-obsessed um, introjective self-absorption into one's own model of reality. The resistance to that um, depraved psychological um, framing uh, is what makes up, I would say, the requisite character of a healthy and functioning member of the royal household. Because in some sense that exemplifies and exhibits a form of fortitude, a form of virtue, a form of courage, of a character of strength, of a kind of innate integrity, um, the British stiff upper lip, as they say. Anyway, I've kind of covered the points that I wanted to cover. So I guess what is egregious in my judgment of this Harry and Meghan become Netflix producers is just simply that they've traded one form of celebrity for another in order to effectively try to rebrand themselves as being a kind of meritorious recipient of adulation rather than a passive one in which they were actually fulfilling some public function and role. I guess this allows them to define it themselves, although I wonder if they couldn't have found an augmented role in which they could not have exercised a kind of producing project or some kind of creative out creative what's the word some kind of creative output owing to the fact that Harry is not the next in line, and therefore perhaps he could be permitted slightly more leeway in expressing political sentiments. Or politically toned messages in his public opinions and views, which in some sense are only given a platform because of an inherited privilege, effectively. Which I might add as well adds to the hypocrisy and the inversion of all values. I was actually going to title this video Harry and Meghan Become Netflix Producers, a sign of or an omen of the apocalypse, because it really does coincide with such an array of decadence, debauchery, denigration of the fabric of society, the inversion of values. You know, it's almost like Nietzsche was a prophet when he said the highest values devaluing themselves. And now that prophecy has actually been fulfilled. What I am now going to also get into and digress into, which is perhaps uncalled for and speculative, about personal elements of Harry and Meghan, speculations of mine, which is not particularly unwarranted, seeing as now they are public figures by their own hand, and their story is publicized and part of that public presence. In what I was discussing earlier, I didn't fully, I guess, expand on the notion that obviously I disagree with their ethical, let's say, psychological ideology and moral assessment, of both society and also, as those themes have supposedly impressed themselves on Meghan and Harry's personal lives, as high class recipients of identity, consciousness, uh, sensitivities, uh, which again is a rather self-imposed infliction, I might add. But anyway, I mean, if in their work as producers, which is also something that I want to expand on, they are going to elaborate. I mean, essentially, so if we can just consider the story of their lives, if their work is going to be a reflection of their own experience to some degree, one can only imagine the quality of moral deprivation and the kind of and the low brow sort of moral atrociousness that will be infused into such self-indulgent entrenchment into one's insulated and self-referencing worldview. That aside, which is by itself, in stark contrast to the things which ironically were represented by, or at least how I was framing the institution of royalty and, let's say, the dream of the ascendancy of the character of the soul, um, which has uh, which has been more widely bestowed and impregnated within the uh, British liberal political philosophy and ethos and culture, which in Britain the royal um, institution is an integral ingredient in keeping that uh, narrative, uh, 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 keeping that formula, um, that archetype accessible and representative within the structure of the social contract, if I might phrase it in that vague sort of way. Let me just move on. That I wanted to speculate on perhaps some of the troubles in the contents I mean, I have no idea. I do not read tabloid type news. I'm merely speculating because of what I know about identity politics and what I know about the ideology and what I know about its proponents. And it does have a toxifying effect on the individual personality style of the of it. Sort of hybridizes a kind of borderline personality disorder, because personality disorder functions in much the same way as identity politics. Um, because you can create this model of reality which is so abstract and so uh, uh, and is modeled within the mind in such a solid way that one can then leverage that imagination, which is very close to the racial imagination, I might say as well, which is another thing to disdain and be disgusted by in terms of its manifestation, but that then it can be leaned on and depended on and relied upon to exert a kind of authoritative narrative in which you can overlay it and project it onto reality and use it to divert pressure off of one's own individual, let's say, lack of humility or developed maturity, and play a kind of, uh, uh, you know, parlor games and parlor tricks, and find a way to divest accountability and the development of character into a systemic complaint, into a complaint about conditions. It's very easy to uh, point at other people's agency uh, in the narrative of identity politics, in that kind of categorization, in that kind of worldview in which the players involved are all generalizations of reductive, dehumanizing, um, categorical factions which people in a form of idolatry in some sense belong to. It's quite disgusting. It's very close to racialism, race. It is almost indistinguishable from a racist world. It is racist worldview. I mean, that's, it's ironic that it calls itself anti-racist. Um, Moving on, but I mean, I'll just say it. I mean, I guess Harry was lucky to get this this break, perhaps, in getting this producer stint, and because, I mean, what happens if this gambit did not pay off? I mean, I'm sure Meghan would have not tolerated that. I mean, and perhaps, I mean, and let me just sort of speculate and predict the future, that there is no way to be satisfied in this worldview. In some sense, you're only corralled by social pressure, by external forces, because you can always just patch together whatever story suits or facilitates the most ease and convenience for yourself, because you never actually have to provide a kind of a moral fiber when you can just divert the pressure off onto and relocate blame into an external locus of control, which identity politics is centered around doing, which is why teaching it to the young and promoting it and broadcasting it is essentially, I mean, I consider it a social evil. I mean, it is essentially propagating and uh, 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 um, advertising the fascist worldview. Essentially, I mean, it's much akin to sort of proto-fascism, um, in that essentially it just has a kind of decentralized furor, in that the narrative of identity politics is a kind of decentralized savior of the system. That's what furor translates to. It means savior. Um, that you need to be saved by some kind of systemic conspiracy theory, the Jewish conspiracy, the conspiracy of white patriarchal privilege. It's these things are functionally interchangeable. I mean, it's a reductive, it's an obtuse treatment of reality. It does not look into why things operate the way they do, how things operate the way they do. It just assumes in a superficial way to promulgate and demand from the top down in some sense. And so, if the gambit did not pay off, or if things don't go as well as they can be imagined to go, I mean, somehow it's always somebody else's fault, and in whatever opportunity comes along, and I mean, who knows what I mean. Look, relationships are hard to keep together no matter what, perhaps because they require work, and perhaps I think this generation especially is not capable of doing the work, especially with this kind of ideological poison of a sort of entitlement that can be indulged in via the vicarious container of the identity. So using that entity of identity and identity politics, one can then indulge in a whole hybridized deployment of borderline personality type um, entitlement, sort of power, um, sort of covert megalomania, uh, weird sort of double standards, um, there's this inability to properly uh, respond to critical opposition, sort of the inability to process disagreement in some sense, and this weird kind of expectation of a kind of unilateral facilitation. It's very representative of everything that is worst about the upper classes. Um, but these borderline sensibilities and uh, inculcated expectations and satiated passions, eventually, they're sadistically edged, malevolent, sort of devouring mother um, archetypal forces usually manifest as dysfunction that essentially has to be burdened by somebody else. Somebody else has to essentially cater to the demands of the narrative, to the expectations and the weird, fuzzy reality that the narrative conveys, and which is being uh, uh, orchestrated by this kind of central unitary vision, which cannot support opposing or nuanced, sophisticated complications. This is why there is always this over reliance on an extremely reductive, oversimplified version of events. In fact, this is how this new era of journalism makes its hay, by essentially not even reporting on the facts anymore, not even trying to give both sides, but merely giving the conclusions of the detractors, of anyone who doesn't follow the orthodoxy, and reporting on those labels as if they were holy writ, because the narrative is the only thing that matters, and there's only one narrative, and then that's problematic, because who issues the narrative? How does it gain its kind of canonical currency? And then you have the kind of the apparatus of a totalitarian culture, which we are already suffering and in the midst thereof, and it is hideous, it is Orwellian, it is disgusting, and uh, I mean, it's sad to a large extent that Meghan and Harry somewhat exemplify so much of the debauchery of our time, but also I would hazard a guess that the actual strength and content of their relationship, sadly, is as, I'm speculating, of course, but is as superficial and tenuous and prone to the emotional drunkenness of the kind of self-indulgent inebriation of the borderline, as they are effectively constantly drunk on their own emotional narrative. And not willing to tolerate anyone lest they imbibe the same drink and uh, fall prey to effectively their emotional passive aggressiveness, and it's functionally a kind of emotional parasitism. Um, Now this is all speculation, but this is the kind of thing that is somewhat part and parcel of the identity politics mentality, and in some sense the only thing that stops it from infecting those closest to you is if it can be compartmentalized neatly enough by the ideological containers, and you can sort of export that kind of spiteful, vengeance seeking, um, ideological bent into some external drama, and you're sort of you have a helper that is helping you do it, and in the same team, in which case you're both vitally invested in attacking that scapegoat, because without it there is no cohesion, and so the cohesion itself is fundamentally a fabrication in league with this psychological schema, which is inculcated within this ideology of identity politics. That, that that's what I see from the outside. That's what I speculate from the outside, looking at Meghan and Harry, and I speculate that on purely on the basis of their politics, which I imagine is a reflection of a decrepit interpersonal dynamic. But obviously, I can't know that. Um, but I believe that this remains important to be stated, and I feel more confident doing this because I wouldn't feel comfortable saying these things, perhaps. Um, well, actually, I wouldn't. It wouldn't be possible for me to say these things if they were actually fulfilling, let's say, their royal role, and that they were essentially silent on politics. Uh, it wouldn't be for me to say these things, but they have, by their own hand, entered the fray. And so I feel it is not unwarranted, although I have said, and I will repeat, that it is somewhat uncalled for, and it is obviously speculative. Um, I guess that is all I have to say on the matter. I thought again that it would be good to finish this subject on a further elaboration, uh, which is perhaps quite a negative prediction on Harry's fate, which is that the ravenous mentality that this ideology and that its sentiment is uh, inculcated and baked into is such a I don't want to say that it's disorganized, because it is in fact quite organized in its internalized sort of model of mismanagement, that the kind of, that essentially the incoherence in the mismanagement is quite orderly. In an orderly fashion, it's externalized onto some scapegoat. But when the resources of the environmental uh, order are expended and exhausted, and because of this parasitic extraction, of this kind of, emotional hostage taking to the narrative, and the reduction of everything into the internal model of reality, when that falls apart, then the earliest convenience and excuse to move on to a higher state of order, to in a more stable fashion parasitically indulge and enjoy in some new vista, or you know basically, I mean, what I'm saying when I'm talking about the fate of Harry is that he's going to get used up, and then he's going to be discarded like a husk, because he's not facilitating the promulgation and the fulfillment of the disgusting, sort of utopian idealism, which is the wedge of the or the, that supports all the instruments of leverage which are exerted in fulfillment of the means justify the ends, narrative, um, sort of environmental hypnotism, which is being projected. And this is an unsustainable psychological um, state. It's a disordered state. It's a personality disorder, effectively, and the hybridized personality disorder that is incumbent uh, within identity politics is going to have these toxic effects, which are either going to be outsourced on a convenient scapegoat, or and in some sense, if they're not being outsourced very efficiently, then elements closer to the adherent or to the proponent of the ideology are going to suffer the consequences. I think that there are going to be immediate consequences to the behavior, uh, I mean, this is a dysfunctional, pathological schema. You cannot think this way and lead a healthy life. It's not possible. You might be able to inhabit the appearances of health and vigor and vitality, but it will be a simulacra, and it will very thinly shield only the functioning and the and offer a kind of empowerment of this very fickle and feeble and fragile um, ideological vision and mentality. Uh, I mean, and this is somewhat inexorable because it's such a pathological and dysfunctional worldview that it even can't even be sensitive to reality well enough to pick up on the fact on how it's basically fueled on a kind of self-generated psychosis. I mean, this is you have to be incredibly self-indulgently self-obsessed and contending with the world of these canonical categories where you have pigeonholed and and racialized and categorized everything into these abstract containers of the identity. I mean, this is, I mean, borderlines are now correctly understood to be what are even is called in the literature. I would go further, but they're called in the literature secondary psychopaths. I would elaborate that and explain that that it's not merely just alloplastic defenses, but it's an alloplastic. Um, it's a stratagem of alloplasticity in order to um, attach to a viable host and extract the continuation of essentially the outsourcing of accountability, the flagrant deployment of blame mechanics in an incoherent and unilateral way that is unceasing and never ending and unable uh, uh, to self correct because it cannot admit to fault. It cannot admit to um, it can't it is not capable of making a mistake. It's so inhuman. It has lost the plot so completely. Its first priority is its um, reductive explanation, which gives a kind of predictive control and comfort, because with that imagination, with that imaginary, predictive, anticipatory modeling of reality, you know, your expectations can be completely assured. You don't have to live with any kind of doubt. Because as an identity living within the identity narrative, you know who to blame. You know how to um, channel uh, and dilute and divert the notion of responsibility into an abyss of a unitary explanation, with in this strange sort of cult of being able to label yourself into a new reality at will, post hoc, where you don't have to take disagreement seriously, because they'll never be a reflection of your pure and special, unique internalness or whatever. You don't have to, these things are just entitled to you. You don't have to develop a character. There is no such thing. It's all gainsaying. It's all imagination, and whoever stops your imagination, they're the oppressors. It's just kind of endless sort of nonsensical drivel that is premised in this incredibly abstracted, sort of delusionary morality. Um, Always leveraging its so-called good intentions, and essentially the indulgence in its stream of emotional consciousness and feelings, which are essentially the it's like the background music of the narrative, and it's always keeping its proponents centralized at the center, of the zeitgeist, of the kind of the world spirit that they then are at the center of, and it's and of the center of making it happen, and are part of the movement, are part of this conglomeration, of this disgusting monstrosity of which is premised in dehumanization and the destruction of individualism, um, into its categorical views on things. But as it does this, it when you use emotions in this way, the one thing that you can't do is somehow it never becomes possible to issue an admission of fault. The emotional state is this kind of cardboard, as long as you fall in line under the right rubric, under the right ring of power, under the right sphere of fulfilling your role in the identitarian sort of system of systemic rehabilitation, as long as you're fulfilling your designated link in the chain, then all things are promised to you. Um, all security is bestowed as long as you are under your your legion and your regimen. Uh, then then there is never a need to use your emotional navigation to even cut down and dissect and rebuild the machine of your emotional navigation is never needed. This is a one size fits all, never look back, sort of jumping off the bridge because everyone else does it. It's sort of, that basic question that maybe parents would tell their young children: if your friend did this, would if your friend did something that sounded crazy, would you just do the same thing because everyone else was doing it? I mean, it's an inane question. It has a principle behind it. It doesn't The principle isn't quite conserved by that mere kind of, well, if your friend was doing something, would you just do it? Would you just succumb to peer pressure? In some sense, this is the sort of the generation that has completely exemplify the fact that you can sort of, you can cross all the boxes and or tick all the boxes and have so little authentic original experience of the inner sanctum that they have fallen prey to, essentially the cult of a personality disorder, um, because all the authority figures uh, signaled and ushered them into this deplorable ethical framework and way of thinking. Anyway, I was going to say about the emotional stream of consciousness is that, well, yeah, it's not capable of it's not capable of having a genuine beingness. It's only capable of having a fabricated beingness. And then the distinction between the fabrication or the social mask and the internal thing is another sort of subset of complications with the hybridized borderline, which gets even more depraved and even more overtly racist and starts looking like the culture of the KKK, which is, we must always remember, traditionally associated with the Democratic Party, which has been forgotten, but the parties have actually kept their characters fairly consistently. I would say that the politics of the Democrats and the cultural, in terms of the cultural divide that it represents, that has stayed, I think, pretty consistently. And to the extent to which that there has been the stereotype that conservatives have an aversion to the black subculture in America is probably because the black subculture, essentially the black population did not so much as get reviled by the conservative mentality originally, but because of the kind of welfare reforms which the Democrats instantiated, that created a kind of ideological divisiveness that inculcated a toxic subculture, which was very toxic, and and the effects of which are apparent, um, which represent the real impediment to progress and development, and which has not been accurately or honestly admitted by, well, this new breed of so-called progressives. Um, it really love their sort of their racialist categorical, sort of, the kind of the intrinsic racial essentialism that's baked into their disgusting worldview, um, which was actually sort of generated by their sort of socially engineered mismanagement of public policy. and the more that that sort of basic fact gets sort of diverted from attention, the more that essentially the problem persists unattended and uncorrected as this continual growth and imagination of the racial imagination in this sort of imagining hypothetical introjective world of introjective objects which are held by these kinds of ideologues continues to dirty the political discourse and the cultural shared common values that make up a functioning liberal society and an open democracy. But I mean, I guess when you're involved in so much toxicity, I guess all you can do is double down and go more deeply and further into exported ruination. But yeah, anyway, I was meant to sort of just make the point that, and make the sort of the general point that characters like this have a long history of leaving bodies in their wake, of leaving people after they have been used up. And perhaps Harry will discover too late that, after a reasonable amount of time has elapsed, when some kind of, because, the borderline sentiment is very destructive. It can set up a whole narrative of abuse which is being covertly orchestrated. It's quite funny, but this is the problem also with domestic abuse to a large extent, is that we can't have serious discussions about it because we have to understand that a lot of so-called female victims are quite insidious psychological perpetrators of a kind of long-term exposure and conditioning in which they kind of evolve their partner into being a kind of hybridized, histrionic sort of pedant, and then they eventually sort of snap them because the workings of their introjective imagination and narrative are leveraged in such an unsustainable way. These are elements which cannot be spoken of in public generally because, they're somewhat too sophisticated, and the level to which the insidious nature of these things play themselves out make it impossible or make it very hard for a culture that is invested in convenient, reductive, oversimplified conventions to guide the way and to designate blame and to connotate, token a tokenism of a kind of ideological guilt and such, for ideological crimes, not being tone sensitive, other forms of kind of cultural totalitarianism. Anyway, in such a wise, it's very easy for these women, when they are comfortable, when they can sort of plan their their migration onto greener pastures, onto, if the opportunity becomes available, to have a more access to a higher state of order from which to extract and parasitic, so I mean, if this producer stint is not stable and Meghan is not able to uh, preserve the life to which that she is accustomed, or to which that she has become accustomed to expecting, and if Harry cannot provide the prestige which, if the story of his life somewhat runs runs out, or pales in comparison, and there is a way to facilitate a an upgrade, I mean, I should just say that he should watch out, because uh, the substance of these kinds of relationships are what I would describe as fundamentally tenuous. They are born of a kind of intrinsic immaturity and juvenile, um, collaborative, uh, sadistically edged, I've already described as a kind of spite-filled, vengeance-driven ideology. And people that are acclimatized to that kind of ethics, there is a spillover. There there is an intrinsic pollution which cannot be um, avoided, and at some point someone has to take those bitter pills. Someone has to swallow that poison, and uh, it's not a good. It's not a good state to live in, but it's also going to probably come to a close at some point. But what I mean by that is that I'm predicting acrimony, uh, public acrimony, to the extent to which that I can only speculate that there is already a level of acrimony which I can only speculate about existing. Anyway, okay, that'll be the end of this subject from my side. There are a few more qualifications that I should make for what I say. So the reason why I say that Harry should look out for Meghan, and for being part of the sort of the human wreckage that is left in the wake of this kind of ideological bent, is because, um, although hypocritically, this kind of way of dealing with reality is, although it goes against, let's say, the superficial shape of its own rhetoric and sentiments, it is largely shaped by convention. It is largely shaped by, let's say, the outside pressure and the container of its orthodoxy, and it uses and leverages conventions to fence and shape its domain. And it takes on the image of those outside conventions, uh, uh, um, and to help sort of structure its and facilitate, its exteriorization and projection of its introjective paradigm. Um, and one of those big cornerstone of those conventions is that females are awarded the privilege of indulging in this more so than males are. Males sort of become secondary facilitators that they eventually have to cede uh, the space to the devouring mother sort of operational archetype. You know, there's sort of very little real equality to be had. It's more of a kind of slavish imprinting on these conventions, which are just taken to be sort of true. So, there are stark, sort of highly hypocritical contrasts between the rhetoric and the sentimentality of its internal philosophy and how it is largely shaped by conventional thinking, by stereotypes, um, by a kind of symbolism and such, which is animated in their imagination and their model of reality. This inherited convention that women are, or females are permitted to indulge uh, in this kind of borderline, um, that females are more permitted to engage in. I mean, they are also male borderlines, but there are so many more female borderlines. And in some sense, this is the historical reason as to why, um, traditionally in most cultures, that they develop a sort of cultural conventions that suppress uh, and oppress females as a class or as a group, um, as that has been a requisite, let's say, development, cultural um, watermark to hold against the tide of that kind of corrosive, um, doom spiraled social values, because those values, borderline values, are so toxic and they need to be repressed. That, sadly, essentially, because it's, we haven't developed the sophistication to identify the underlying poison, the underlying toxicity. We haven't developed the psychological, um, grammar, or the psychological vocabulary to identify and to underline what the actual problem is. That essentially the in older societies, the baby was thrown out with the bathwater, and females in general were castigated and put under the thumb of conventions to hold these, I mean, which itself becomes a kind of paradox. And now, because of, let's say, genuine equality, let's say the underlying reason for the traditional oppression has now, risen to the surface, and if it's not dealt with maturely, consciously, and with nuance, and that essentially, we are going to suffer collectively and go back. It's almost actually the sort of the Marxist hypothesis in cultural, uh, development, that if we don't actually progress through a phase, we're forced to relive history, sadly. Um, so in some sense, I would consider myself a version of a kind of Marxist analyst, although I think it pertains more to psychological politics than it does to a kind of economic politics. And in some sense, I do think that the impediment to real progress is on the psychological frontier, that it has always been our inability to control our own culture consciously because we have not developed the strength of moral character to essentially do our own accounting and be responsible enough to be able to transcend the trappings of a system that visits upon us the consequences of our own moral failings, which we are still unable to properly diagnose. Um, and these are largely on a kind of psychological or even perhaps spiritual frontier. Um, and so we make incorrect calls about um, polemics and falsely reducing situations into oversimplified reductions. It's worthy to point out that the real engine of Nazi culture and the development of Nazi society was spearheaded by women. By the females were the heart of the Nazi movement. They really advanced it. They made it in the same way that feminism has been the vanguard of identity politics. People forget this historically, just how much of a duplication this is in the cultural um, development of this movement. I mean, people even forget how the Nuremberg dissatisfaction marches, where the Nazis marched hand in hand with the communists to essentially destabilize the liberal Weimar Republic and to essentially demand justice for the identity rather than for the liberal individual, because this was electorate that had bought into the propaganda, had bought into the ideological narrative. They did not want to be treated as an electorate with accountability for their governance. They wanted to be treated as an infantilized um, identity to be pandered to and to be essentially to have their missing accountability collectivized into a systemic narrative and explanation and reduction for everything with an with an oversimplified one size fits all solution to every problem. Uh, the problem of a convenient scapegoat in which all the complications of reality are neatly compacted into a useful target, um, which somehow only the people at the top of the pyramid, you know, I mean, Harry himself being a white male, somehow it doesn't quite apply to him because of the special place that he merely got to inherit. Because shouldn't we all, in this ideal utopian idea, be someday lucky to inherit uh, a sacred identity that has been bestowed on us by the system as we all receive this. You know, it's this weird sort of obsession with identity politics and inheriting the sort of the silver spoon that the identity is owed is the kind of, I mean, I've described it as well as a kind of, as generally one of the overarching tactics, which also exists within borderline, is the sleight of hand in which envy is passed off as jealousy. Because when you can convert and translate envy into jealousy, um, and rebrand envy as jealousy, you can essentially justify any method of attack and any convoluted obfuscation of even your own standards and do your own moral gerrymandering, because the ends can always be because essentially if the identity can be jealous for you, then it can conceal your envy that is the basis of your motivation for engaging with the ideology, and allows you to freely indulge in without self-reflection, without with a perfect sort of insulation against criticism. And in that way, it really creates this kind of this this dark pact in which one seals into unconsciousness one's own rotten sort of bad faith for engaging in this reductive cover story that allows one to counterfeit that conversion of envy to the jealousy that is rightly advanced. I mean, rightly in the relativity of the ideology that is so called justified in the worldview of the identity centric moral consideration, in which moral consideration is only owned by identity and nothing else, in such a dehumanized, barren landscape of moral depravity. And that's the only trade-off you have to do to be able to do that. Because if the identity is foremost, then what does it matter if you as an individual are engaging in envy, when constructively it is the jealousy of the identity? It's open to interpretation, and it's irrelevant which way it's interpreted, because only one, according to them, is important, which is relative to the identity. So in the eyes of the identity, envy is forgiven as just mere jealousy that is justified and rightful, to be to be the vehicle of liberation. And so it underwrites a disgusting kind of self-immolation of internal resource, which expands and explodes a kind of self-deception and an inculcated childishness, which, as I've said, conventionally women have been permitted this more than males have within our culture, within our cultural residue, and in our cultural inheritance. That is something that is going to have to be reversed if we are going to secure the real gains of equality that were, I would say, culturally came to a head in the 90s, which we have obviously regressed from because of essentially this reactionary feminism, which is, as I say, culturally indistinguishable from the advent and the march of popularity in fascist ideology, which, as I say, is very similar to the worldview, the racist worldview, which underpins identity politics. So all these factors are important, but that is why I say that Harry should have to watch out in being shed like a husk when he becomes perhaps no longer able to provide Meghan with the um, centralness of attention that his story sort of makes accessible. If she has another option, perhaps. I mean, or if she can envisage a way in which, I mean, I don't know what kind of world they live in, but in 10 years' time, perhaps when the kids are slightly older, then you might hear stories about abuse, and then how she's fell into the arms of some high status Hollywood entity, or something like that. Uh, well, I mean, I guess perhaps it depends on how secure the money is, or something like that. Again, it's uncalled for me to speculate in these matters, but it's not unwarranted in the context and the contents of what I have gone through. Even if it does not apply to Meghan and Harry's personal relationship, is even a useful exploration of the subject. Perhaps people have learned something from my opinion on these ideological and psychological matters.